Hey, Neil. Okay, everybody, we'll be starting in a few minutes. If you have any questions, in the meantime, feel free to send us a chat message. I'll keep an eye on those as Neil is presenting.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yes, I guess we'll just wait a couple minutes and then we'll start. See if anybody else arrives. So, Neil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Are we ready to go? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Okay, terrific. Then let me just get my Windows set here. All righty. So delighted to be here. Happy to be talking about executive functions and Mindprint. I come to this really from the world of tutoring. So I've been tutoring since really the early '90s, and I came here via Mindprint because for many years, decades in fact, a lot of what we've done in tutoring has really been based on very hard-earned experience, and hard-earned intuition. And when I first came in contact with Mindprint, what I saw was that for the very first time, so many of these things that we've done based on hunch and intuition are now, in fact, knowable and measurable. And as a tutor, that is incredibly exciting. And when it comes to things like executive functions and trying to figure out when I see students who aren't performing to the level that I think they're capable of, then you have this inevitable question of why. And often as tutors, the only way to answer that is through either intuition, kids that we've seen before, and or through trial and error. And neither of those are particularly efficient. So being able to have a clear look at what's working for a student and and why the things that we're seeing are the way they are, it makes us more efficient, it makes us smarter, and ultimately makes us more effective as tutors. And that's incredibly exciting to me. And I hope that that all of our students see the results of that. So let's we're going to jump into specific time management strategies, but first I want to draw a distinction between the language we're going to use here of executive functions and time management and processing speed or flexible thinking, and the things that we use to describe the problem, and really what you're probably actually seeing. So to use myself as an example, I could give my oldest son a 15-minute homework assignment, and he's going to stretch it out to 2 hours easily. And that's with me like riding him and reminding him every 10 minutes. So there is this sort of the reality that we're experiencing, what we see our kids doing and struggling with and doing well. And then there's the, sort of dry explanations for it that we see that we're going to talk about here. And I want to try to attach those two things back together. And it's being a parent it is hard because oftentimes the problems are obvious, but the solutions might not be. And of course, we really want to get it right. And so, first and foremost, before we get into any specifics, I really want to point out that the most critical and essential element is simply that you care, that the tutor cares, that the people involved care. It is the one thing that all great teachers have in common. And I think about many of the great teachers I've had, and I've had great ones who knew the content, great ones who didn't, and we learned it together. I've had great ones who were incredibly articulate and delightful to listen to, other ones whose English wasn't very good. But the thing that tied them all together is they cared about me as a learner and cared enough to try to work through all of the challenges that come with learning. So the very fact that everyone's here is already a big part of the solution. It's already saying that you care and are making the effort to learn and find solutions and be open to possibilities and just putting in the time and effort. So first of all, just congratulations to everyone for that. That is probably the most important piece in all of this. I'm going to go ahead and just dive on in and cruise through. I see Dan put up a comment about asking questions. So please jump in at any time. You have the chat. Dan, if you see some stuff that comes up in the chat, just chime on in.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll be cruising along.
Okay.
So let's start first with Nancy and Eric, who founded Mindprint, and I'm bringing this up not to talk about Mindprint, but just because I think there's an instructive story here. So here we have two people, one of whom was in finance, the other whom was an engineer, two very quant savvy people, let's call them, and somehow they end up with two daughters who say, "I hate math," and this, of course, did not compute with them at all. That made zero intuitive sense. How can this be? And so they did, frankly, what all of us parents want to do is they blamed it on the school. They said, "Oh, well, clearly it's not it's inconceivable that my daughters don't like math. It must be bad teachers or bad curriculum." And I don't want to say that weaker teachers or curriculum that doesn't jibe doesn't happen. That, of course, does. But in their case, they found out that there were actually some other things at work. They had one daughter who had some anxiety, and that was preventing her from finishing work, from turning in work, from feeling good and confident about her work. And another one whose abstract reasoning was simply not as strong as her verbal reasoning. And that meant that working with abstract concepts like she was encountering in math were harder for her. And here she had these two super quant parents, and recognizing that was harder for her was difficult to do. And again, back to the language of parenting and what we're experiencing and the behaviors we're seeing versus the language we're going to talk about today. All of these things were expressed the same. If you look at a student who's in a math class whose curriculum is not working for them, and a student who has some anxiety around school and assignments, and or a student whose abstract reasoning is weaker than her verbal reasoning, it's all going to look the same from the perspective of a parent, which is a kid who seems unengaged, doesn't want to jump into the work, doesn't want to do the work, has trouble completing the work. It looks like a kid who is underperforming, and oftentimes our response to that um, is is again, it's sort of based on intuition and guesswork, but really in order to solve these problems are clear. We really can't move forward in a constructive way until we get to the why. What's the cause for these things? So let's take a look at kids whose apparent challenge seems to be simply not getting the work done. But before we do that, let's dig in a little bit deeper, and talk about more specifically the challenges. Is it trouble starting the work? Is it trouble finishing the work? Is it trouble with being distracted along the way? Is it trouble with finishing the work, but it has errors? It looks quote unquote sloppy. Um, all of these things can be expressions of different potential causes, and until we know what that cause is, we can't really find the appropriate solution. So the first diagnostic fork in the road, let's call it, starts here with, is it a can't or is it a won't? And again, what I can't reinforce enough is, to the naked eye, these two things look exactly the same. Here I have a student who is not performing up to their expectation. We know that they're smart. We know that they're capable. And yet here they are struggling in a particular course or with school in general. And so this first question of, is it a can't or a won't? There are radically different responses to, depending on which one it is. If it's a can't, and we treat it like a won't, and we start saying, well, look, clearly you don't want to work. You need to sit up. You need to pay attention. You need to buckle down and get serious about it. And suddenly we find ourselves yelling at our own kid for something that the kid actually is legitimately struggling with. And then we're going to lose trust, and then we're going to lose influence, and then it's going to be even harder to build that back. On the flip side, let's say it is a won't, but we treat it like a can't. Now we are in fact letting them off the hook and losing an opportunity to have them learn more and perform at a higher level, because we've addressed the problem incorrectly. Today we're going to focus primarily on the can'ts. So the won't is, that's a very different conversation, and that's a conversation that requires a lot of digging into, exactly why it's a won't. But what I want to look at today is specifically executive functions, and what the combination of, let's say, complex reasoning plus executive functions is going to tell us is, it specifically, is it a can't or a won't? And if it is a can't, then we're going to dig in and start figuring out specifically what is the problem. And once you know the problem, then we can start to apply specific solutions. And just one more thing about this notion of a can't. Can't may simply mean that on a relative basis, some skills are weaker than other skills. And when we see a student struggling, we're going to start by looking at the weaker of the skills, because that's the most likely culprit. Whatever that skill is, there is invariably strategies that we can employ to support that skill and or work around that skill. So we may not be able to make the skill itself stronger, at least not in the time frame that we're talking about. But it doesn't mean that we can't find solutions for the problem. And ultimately, if we have solved the problem, the specific makeup of the skill ceases to be an issue. And so, whether we're addressing the skill itself or simply addressing the strategies, the net result and the outcome is the same. Okay, so let's assume that we are addressing specifically executive function challenges. So, being specific on exactly what the challenge is, do we have a student who is struggling to sit down, engage, and get started on the work, right? You feel like you have to like duct tape them to the chair and use any number of bribes and threats just to get it started. That's one. Second specific challenge here is once maybe they start, but what should be a 15-minute or a 1 hour task might take, well, frankly, all weekend, because every time you turn around, they're doing something different that is not the assignment that they should, in fact, be working on. Right? Are they easily distracted? Do they have trouble maintaining focus and putting the work in over time? Problem number two, specific challenge number two, let's call it. Number three, doesn't finish, right? So like they can get started, they can put the work in, but they never do quite wrap it up, dot the I's, cross the T's, turn the assignment in, finish the whole thing up, do the final proofread, and get it off and on, off their desk and into the hands of the teacher, on the due date. That's a third problem, and then the fourth one is, yes, they finished, but there are scattered errors. And this one comes up a lot, and I hear this language from tutors all the time where they say, or I sit down with a student and I say, well, what happened there? And they go, oh, that error, don't worry, I won't do that on test day. And like, not true. A careless error can be every bit as impactful in terms of getting in the way of learning or achievement as a conceptual error. So I don't want to, one, let's not dismiss this as a careless error, but let's also not diminishing it by calling it sloppy, because there could be something else going on there. So let's take each one of those on their own. So let's talk specifically about getting started. So first and foremost is create a routine, right? And when I say create a routine, it doesn't mean say it once, try it for a week, and then forget about it in the second week and start looking for the new solution. It absolutely takes weeks to put a good routine together. It means being diligent about sticking to that routine and making sure that it eventually becomes habit. So we're going to create a space in which to work. That includes a clean, organized desk. That includes a regular time for work. And let's make sure that everyone is respecting that space and that work is happening at the same time, regularly, every day, every week, over the course of weeks, so that eventually the student becomes habituated to recognizing, okay, now is the time for me to focus and get my work done. But then while they're doing it, small rewards are terrific. Don't feel bad about that. Like it feels like a bribe, but if it gets the job done, it gets the job done. 10 minutes of screen time for 30 minutes of work is totally legit. This is a problem we're trying to solve here of getting students to sit down, to prioritize, and get the work done on time. And whether that's a daily routine or a weekly routine is going to depend on the pattern of the assignments. And calendar management as it comes up. So let's start there with getting started. For students who are easily and regularly distracted. So the first and most obvious point there is let's remove the distractions, right? So make sure they have a clean place to work, an organized place to work. Turn off all the devices, the pop-ups, the alerts. I know that when I look at my kids' computers because they're home learning remotely, the first thing I look for is what are the other tabs they have open? Yes, they are on the online learning platform, but if you look closely, they've also got the Mindprint tab open. They've also got the YouTube tab open. And let's make sure you get rid of all those things. For some kids can juggle that. And for some kids, that's fine because that is a little reward that they give themselves when they complete things. But for kids with weak attention, that is just a deadly distraction that is going to suck their attention and suck their time. And it's best to remove that altogether. And I also really want to reinforce that this is a whole family issue, right? So if there are siblings in the house and you have worked hard to create a dedicated space for work to occur, made sure that it's clean, make sure that it's organized and ready to go, the whole family needs to respect that space as well and respect that time and know that, okay, this is my son's work time. And it doesn't help if, his little brother comes over and wants to distract him or, whack him on the head with something, right? Like that is not the definition of quiet, dedicated, serious workspace. Now, if that stuff is occurring, because some of it is natural and unavoidable, let's put it into breaks, right? Like, so kids with weak attention in particular, those breaks are absolutely crucial. They need that outlet. So script it into the routine. Make sure that they're standing up and stretching every 15 to 20 minutes. If they need to go and like interact with their brother who's been harassing them, let that happen, but create a scripted space for it to happen so that it doesn't take over the rest of their work. At 5 or 6 minutes every 20 minutes. I mean, look, you have to read your student and be flexible and know what works and know what the right levels are. It absolutely needs to be there, whether it's 2 minutes or 5 minutes, whether it's every 15 minutes or every 30 minutes. That's a judgment call that you'll have to make. But make sure that outlet is there. And that's something to create and feel good about, not something to fight or resist, if that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about not finishing. So first and foremost is checklists are fantastic because checklists are unavoidable. Make them physical, make them visible. Checklists on a phone or on a computer are, if you have to dig into it to get it, if it's not there in your face, it's just not as effective. So print them out, hang them on the desk, and make them fairly granular. And the reason to make them fairly granular is because every time something gets done, the student gets to go and physically check it off that list. And every time they do that, there's a little tiny whoosh of dopamine. There's a little tiny feel-good moment, a little reward there for completing something. And these rewards build on themselves. They help to reinforce positive habits. It's a fantastic thing. And the more that occurs and that positive reinforcement occurs, then we get a virtuous cycle that snowballs. Now, ultimately, our goal is to teach students to do this on their own, to ask open-ended questions. How can we break this down? What should be on this checklist? What is the right cadence of assignments? how much time do you need? Because we certainly want them to be involved in creating this, and ultimately, they need to be able to do these things on their own. They need to be able to leave your nest and go out on their own and be their own self-directed learners. But have some patience. That doesn't happen overnight, and if some scaffolding has to happen, I'll tell you one of my favorite rules is you created this space for them to work. You've created a time for them to work. When they're done with their work, the last thing that they should do is set up their assignments and set up their space so that when they come back and start again tomorrow, everything is there and ready to go, and they don't need to spend another 10 minutes looking for the pencil sharpener and the pencil and opening the windows and plugging in the headset and doing all, like, it's there and ready to go. Now, ultimately, you're going to want your own student to have that habit and do that for him or herself. But because we're talking about students for whom this may be a weakness right now, it's okay for you to do it a little bit first. Start them with that scaffolding, get it in place, and then slowly you can pull back on these things. So it's when it comes to teaching them to do this on their own, look for opportunities for these insights and these habits to come from them. Which means if every single time you say to them, okay, it's 5 o'clock, it is time to do your math homework, sit down, open your chapter, I have the assignment from your teacher, here it is, check back in with me in 20 minutes. That is good to get them started, and in a lot of cases, entirely necessary. But over time, if you can pull back on that and say, okay, it's 5 o'clock, what do you need to do now? Or 5 o'clock, how do you want to get started on this? Or I've seen your assignment, let's put it on the calendar. How do you want to break this up? You can start to offload the executive functioning of that onto them. But it's okay if that is a process, right? So maybe the primary executive functions are coming from you at first because you're the executive, and damn it, it's necessary because we got to get stuff done. But be aware that the ultimate goal is to have this come from them, and the more you can shed this stuff slowly over time as it's appropriate, the better. Okay, and then let's talk about this last one of finishing with scattered errors. So, because a lot of these things look the same and are the same for behavior, a lot of the solutions are similar. So, checklists, still, we want them to get stuff done. We want the positive reinforcement of feeling good when things do get done. We want the visual, physical action of having that inescapably in front of you there to maintain focus and keep them on track. One thing, though, for students with weak executive functions, and this is a sort of an interesting subtlety, is that it's not necessarily that, let's say it's weak attention. It's not necessarily that they're having trouble. I mean, sometimes it is they're having trouble focusing in the moment, but sometimes it's that they're not aware of the moment. And what I mean by that is their ability to keep track of time as it's moving may not be the same as your own. And so when you say to them, okay, you're playing a game on your computer 5 more minutes, and then you give them 6 minutes, 7 minutes because you're nice. Maybe you let it stretch to 10 minutes because you don't feel like having the argument. But when you go back and you're like, look, it's been 10 minutes. I told you, 10 minutes ago, they only had 5 more minutes. That 10 minutes may be entirely clear to you, but not at all clear to them. to them, they may not have been aware of that time at all. So introducing a timer, not in a punitive way, not to say you must be done by this point, because we don't want to rush them. Like they need to get the work done and done well, but to begin over time to build an awareness of time, an awareness of how much time things are taking. So, and this is helpful in terms of getting them involved. This is part of the conversation. So let's say that they do take what looks like a large assignment, and you work with them to break it into smaller chunks. And you plot those chunks on a calendar into a checklist over the course of a week, because we want them to get started early and work a little bit every day, because that's easier from an organizational standpoint. It's less of a headache when you got this big task due the next day. That's overwhelming, but little tasks are easier to accomplish. All of those good habits, but then ask them to estimate how much time they think each task will take. Write that down. So go ahead and write it on your checklist, and then put a clock there and time it. And again, this isn't a kitchen timer where when it dings, like everything has to stop and you got to pull the cake out or it's going to be burnt. This is simply to help them both begin to evaluate the amount of time it takes, but also if you both estimate that a task is a 15-minute task, and then suddenly you find that it's a 30-minute task, the reason may be really interesting. There's something worth digging into there. Maybe it was a particularly hard math problem, and now actually you have to sit down and go over a concept there. It wasn't simply practicing and reinforcing thing. Maybe it was a bad curriculum thing. Maybe the whoever wrote that assignment wrote it on the assumption that this was 30 minutes worth of work, but in fact, it wasn't 30 minutes worth of work at all. And that's not your student's fault. It's not your fault. It was a bad assignment. So we both want to build that awareness of time, but also there's a lot to be learned from any discrepancies between how much time we think it's going to take and how much time it actually takes. Also, sometimes those discrepancies have a pattern, right? Like some tasks are going to take longer, some are going to take less time, and you may discover what that pattern is, and then you can begin to adjust, and then you can begin to anticipate, and then you can also teach your student to adjust and anticipate. And now, slowly over time, they're becoming self-aware as learners. And when they become self-aware of learners and they know what takes time and what doesn't take time and how to estimate that time, now what you're really doing is creating executive function habits and strengthening that executive function muscle. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Admittedly, it takes time, but this little day-to-day, week-to-week habit creation is crucial for that. Then, of course, let's put the stretching in. Let's script time for there to be an outlet, so that it does happen, so that they don't lose focus, and so the little like, oh gosh, I need a break, I'm going to go onto YouTube doesn't turn into 2 hours. It really sticks to a little 5-minute reward. But then we get to this notion of checking work. So certainly from a standardized test standpoint, no one should be leaving time on the table, right? Like I've seen kids, especially kids with processing speed that is fast. They will finish a section with 5 or 6 minutes to go, and they'll go, "Okay, well, I'm done. I get a little break now." But no, you need to give them strategies for going back and checking work. And going back and checking work doesn't mean I went back and I looked and there was an answer there. Therefore, I checked and yes, there was an answer. So that's checking work. that is not checking work. So this will differ by subject and by assignment, but being very specific about what it means to either spot check or double check things or mark things along the way that they have less confidence in the answer or ones that they know for sure they got right. There are a bunch of strategies to be used there, and I'm quite sure that Dan's tutors are going to have a bunch of them and spend a lot of time on this because it's crucial. But let's use that time efficiently. But again, build that habit, build the awareness, because ultimately the problem we're trying to solve are students who, yes, are finishing on time, but have what appears to be sloppy work. And it may not then be them being sloppy. It may be an attention issue, an executive function issue. And until we build habits in to address those things, then either it continues or we continue to characterize them as being quote unquote sloppy or not caring, but that may not be the case at all. It may simply be that no one's taught them how to go back and use that time effectively and check that work. And then the last thing to put in there is how do we get on the, did I go backwards somehow? Oops. The last thing to check in there is anxiety and depression, and this can show up in a lot of different ways. It can exacerbate what are regular executive function problems can be made worse and appear to be worse because of anxiety and depression. So ultimately, you're going to have to dig in on the root cause, right? And give them as much support and empathy as possible. But when along the way, as we work through it, because these things take a long time to work through, a lot of the same behavioral stuff matters and helps. So routines and checklists, keep them going, right? We don't want them to, as long as they're working, staying engaged in the work, they are being productive, and it's harder to spin off the rails emotionally or wallow in anxiety or worry about what's coming next or how it's going to be perceived, or all, like, if they are focused on the work, then it's easier to keep some of those things at bay. Certainly nutrition and sleep. I mean, I know it sounds really basic, but it's it's just like medically true. Like the good nutrition and a full night's sleep help. Getting outside, sunlight, a little bit of exercise helps. And it doesn't mean that they got to go run 5 miles. I mean, just go for a walk. Maybe that's a nice outlet to just get outside, stretch the legs a little bit, get out in the sunlight. It helps. Now, again, this is a very real and a serious thing, and it goes beyond executive functions. And so certainly you're going to have to be empathetic, be flexible. Like, you can't go wrong with just giving them more love. But you do need to dig in on that, on the root cause. And that's probably another conversation for another day, but important. Okay. I threw this in here just to talk about, I've mentioned checklists a couple of times. Here's a little sample of what a checklist might look like. Break it down into lots of little steps, because we want lots of opportunities to check stuff off, because we like that. That feels good. That's fun. That feels like progress. So keep it simple, print it out, make it visible. Feel free to put the time estimates on there. I think on the Mindprint website, we probably have some examples of this. I can also send some over to Dan to use as well. We're in the process of building these out by subject area. But there's a sample of what they can and should look like. If you have questions, and it's coming back to where I started, of behaviorally, a lot of these things may look the same, but the causes may be very different, and may not be immediately apparent to observation. If you want to know and you want that assessment and you want to know, okay, where does my student stand on working memory versus attention versus flexible thinking? Go ahead and take a Mindprint. You can do it through Dan, and you'll know. And then we don't have to do this through guesswork or trial and error. We can hone in specifically on the weaker areas and immediately start applying the right strategies to shore those up. So that is available to you at any time. It takes about an hour. You do it online. It's self-paced, and it will yield precise measurements of these things. I threw this in here just so you know. It looks like a series of 9 short, discrete brain games. So there's no math. There's no reading comprehension. There's no multiple choice. It's not a questionnaire, all of which is to say your kid is not going to hate you for forcing you to do it. It's actually kind of fun. I mean, they don't know that yet, but once they start doing it, generally they see it's kind of fun. It's kind of interesting. And they're usually really, really curious about the results. And that can yield some really wonderful conversations that begin to build self-awareness. For many, many years, I taught GRE students. And in any given GRE class, inevitably half the class would start the conversation by saying, "I stink at math." And the minute they say it, it instantaneously becomes true, even though it's not true. There's no such thing as someone who's inherently good or bad at math. Math is a really big subject, and there are some parts at math that you may not be as good at, or some other parts that you may be better at, and there are strategies for those things. But once you can start to build the awareness of, no, you're not bad at math, it's just, let's say, nonverbal memory. You're having trouble hanging on to and applying the right formulas. So let's get at a better way to apply those things. And if you can change that mindset from, I hate this, I'm bad at this, therefore I don't like it and I don't want to do it, to, oh, no, this is my skill set. I know when I bump into things that look like this, I use these strategies. And now suddenly I can access the parts of math that are actually fun, that are actually interesting. Because there are a lot of parts of math that are fun and interesting. But the minute they walk in saying, I hate this, this stinks, I'm no good at it, then it stinks and they look like they're no good at it. But that may not be the problem. So you do the assessment, you get the report back. Now we know what that relative makeup of skills are, and that can yield wonderful conversations that lead to self-awareness for the students, so that they can start to feel confident and feel good about their work, as opposed to simply thinking they're not good at something, as opposed to simply this resting on a weaker skill for which we have a series of strategies. Okay. I got a question here. How do you help students who plan for getting something done over time, week or month, but have a hard time staying with the plan? I see a lot of both adults that I manage and or students that I'm working with who have gotten wonderfully comfortable with project management tools and online software and Google Docs, and they're these things are wildly efficient and fantastic for collaboration in particular, and real-time edits, and I love those things. But you could tell there was a but coming there. To the extent that you make these things visible and unavoidable, everything gets easier. I have 3 kids doing remote schooling at home right now, and I know that they have a schedule over time, but when I'm walking past them as they're working, if I can't see that schedule, it's no good to anybody. It's no good to them because they sure aren't clicking into their schedule as often as they should be. And I only have a minute or two as I'm walking past, so I can't see it. And then that thing is effectively buried and invisible. So I would say the first thing is have them make it or help them to make it, but print it out, make it physical and visible, and hang it where it is unavoidable, and then turn it into a checklist. And with lots of nice interstitial steps so that they get that constant, wonderful, good feeling and feedback of checking things off and seeing progress. And that's a physical thing. I mean, I know that the electronic tools they're nice and they're helpful, and there's some great frameworks there that you can replicate. But maybe it's just me being old school. I'm a big believer in make it physical. Sometimes you can't control their brain, but you can control their hand, and if you can control their hand, by extension, you can control their brain. So put it someplace where no one can avoid it. Make it visible to everyone, and that keeps it front and center. That keeps the attention on it, and you can easily check in on it at a glance. Both you can and your student can. So what else can we talk about? What other questions? Dan, how are we doing on time?
We have about 15 minutes left. So anybody who has questions, please go ahead and throw them up on the chat. One question I wanted to ask you about, Neil, is this question about how do you prioritize? Like, a kid might have a hard time differentiating between something that's kind of relatively minor and something that's going to be a lot more important in terms of their grade or other things that they need to accomplish.
So priorities are like sometimes the priorities will be quite clear, right? And that depends a little bit on the extent to which you're involved in their regular day-to-day assignments, and often teachers are quite clear about letting you know, hey, here's how much this is going to account. If you missed an assignment early on, here's a way you can get some of that time or grade back. And it's been my experience that most teachers are happy to share that information with parents and to equip you to help with those decisions. When it comes to smaller things, there is certainly a balancing act there of scheduling, things like scheduling breaks in, scheduling time to do other things that are fun and rewarding and engaging. It matters, and I don't want to diminish those. One thing you can do with your checklists and with your list, and as you break these things down into categories, is think about 2 categories of items that go on the list. One is the absolute must do, or the world comes to a screeching halt. Like this is like cannot move forward until this is done. But then the other one is can do, or should do, or would like to do if I have time to do it. And it's thinking about things in those 2 major categories can help break a list down into manageable size and can help keep your focus on that important but not urgent quadrant as opposed to the urgent but not important quadrant. And then with your list of things that absolutely must happen, put numbers on them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They all have to get done that day, so it doesn't really matter where those numbers go. But when one task is done, knowing at a glance where to go next, as opposed to task is done, stopping, thinking about it. It's not immediately clear, so I'm going to get up and go downstairs and get a cookie, and then I'm going to come back and check my email, and then I'm going to click on this video real quick, and before I know it, I've blown 30 minutes. Before that can happen, knowing that number 2 is done, so now I can jump into number 3. Or before I go from 2 to 3, I'm going to give myself a quick 5-minute stretch break, and then I can jump into 3. That's also, I think, a helpful habit to get into.
I think there's a couple of things that you said that are really important. One is the idea of taking breaks and getting exercise. I think people underestimate how important it is to get exercise and what that does for your mind, not just for your body. And if you build that in regularly, you can actually be a lot more efficient. You may not be spending quite as much time on your behind, supposedly getting work done, but when you have that kind of a break and, both physically and mentally, you can be a lot more effective. So I think that's a really great strategy. And I also think, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I realized that after I was done talking before we did questions, we probably all should have stood up for a quick stretch break, jumping jack break, because here we are, we've gone past 45 minutes without a break. Let's get the blood moving again.
Right. Well, I'll say one more thing, and then we have a comment from one of our attendees. I think another thing that happens sometimes with students is they don't know what's important. So they might have an assignment or several assignments, and part of it is stuff that you need to really focus on and pay attention and do extremely well with. And then there are other things that are just not that important. You don't need to spend a ton of time on those. I think sometimes kids have a hard time telling them apart. They might spend 30, 40 minutes on something that's really not necessary. They just kind of get stuck in the weeds a little bit. So that's another thing that kids, I think, have to learn how to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a terrific point. And I just want to reinforce that this notion of time is often very much in the eye of the beholder. And so we as a parent may see them sink 40 minutes or 3 hours into something, and we go, what are you thinking? That is, how can you possibly put 3 hours into, Minecraft? That's not important. But for them, it wasn't 3 hours. If they may not have experienced that time in the same way. That's where bringing the clock into the equation and building that awareness, so that, here we are saying, oh, they have no ability to prioritize. Look at how they spent their time. But that's us from the outside looking in with our notion of how the time works. But for them, that awareness of time just may not have been there. And that's the difference between a can't and a won't. It looks like a bad decision to spend the time that way, but it wasn't a won't. It was more of a can't. They just didn't realize, because that's an inherent weakness that we need to work on with them. And so this notion of priorities is, I think, tied to notions of time.
That's a common thing that kids may not be aware of, is the passage of time and how you measure time. So the comment we have is, are you working with parents to reinforce the tools you shared? I think this is something that Mindprint actually does very well with the toolbox and the strategies that it provides. Can you talk about that for a few minutes, Neil?
Yeah, certainly. So we have a whole treasure trove of strategies, all linked to specific cognitive skills. But if you try to give a student 50 strategies, that is tantamount to giving them none, right? Because there's just no way to do all of these things. Even the stuff we talked about today, like pick a couple of ones that you think are powerful, start there, and then build up over time. So there is a whole wealth of strategies on the site. They are linked to cognitive skills, but one of the things that the site is going to do for you is it's going to optimize those strategies for the best fit for each student, given that student's cognitive skill sets. So you're going to start with the one or two strategies that we think are going to be the most important and the most effective for that user, given who that user is and what their strengths and weaknesses are. That's first thing. And then once you drill down into those strategies, what you find is a definition of it, often a blurb on the science of learning, why it's important, why we care about it. And then many of them even come with their own built-in checklists. And all those things are printable and emailable. And you can certainly share them with your tutor. You can share them with teachers. You can print them out and stick them on the desk. And that's what they're there for. So yeah, a lot of that comes built in once you've taken the Mindprint. In some ways, that's the easy part. And then the hard part comes in the weeks and months after that, as you try to build new habits and new strategies, depending on what your student needs.
There's certainly a ton for parents to delve into if they do the assessment and then they sort of go into, like you said, the innards of what's available. If you click through the links in the report, it's just a very valuable resource that's in there. But I think your point is also well taken that it could be overwhelming. You want to be careful not to sort of like think, oh my God, I have to do all this stuff. You really need to sort of, again, back to prioritizing what's the most important thing and where are we going to get the best result in, one thing at a time rather than just trying to do it all at once.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that the toolbox will do for you, is set those priorities, optimize them based on the needs of the student, him or herself. That's in fact, that's the whole point, is differentiating that approach based on the individual needs of each student.
One other thing I'll say before we finish up here is if you're a professional, if you're a tutor or another professional that works with students, Mindprint allows you to do your own Mindprint at no charge, so you can get a sense of what it looks like. You can see your profile, and then you can kind of dive into the back end of the toolbox and all the strategies and everything. So I think that's a really great opportunity for people if they want to just kind of get a sense of how it helps.
I often think about, I was talking to a parent a month or two ago, and she was talking about her son whose visual memory is terrific, but verbal memory is weaker. And she was saying that before the Mindprint, she had, they'd be leaving to go to the beach, let's say, and she'd sort of like yell upstairs, don't forget your towel and bring a bag and, bring the suntan lotion. And then 5 minutes later, the kid would come downstairs, no towel, no bag, no suntan lotion. And she'd look at him and go like, what, are you just not listening to me? Like, what is wrong with you? I just told you this. And until she realized that verbal memory is weak for him and that she needs to repeat these things or show it to him or give it to him in a different way, she just had this tendency to get frustrated. And it occurred to me the other day that this is probably true with lots of the relationships in our lives, whether at work or at home or with spouses, that sometimes you say, I told him that 13 times and still he hasn't done it. What is wrong with him? And maybe it's a won't, but maybe it's a can't. And maybe knowing a little bit about the person you're communicating with can help you optimize the effectiveness of that communication and cut down on what otherwise would be a moment of frustration and an argument.
And also, it's a place for the student to learn some self-knowledge so they can advocate for themselves. I actually have the same issue, and it occurs for me when I go to a restaurant. Remember back in the days before COVID when we could go to a restaurant? somebody would come up and say, "Hey, here are specials," and the person lists the specials verbally, and it just goes like this. I don't remember any of it. So unless I can see the specials in writing, it's kind of worthless for me because it just doesn't register. I don't have that kind of memory. So I actually have that same issue, but I'm aware of it, so I can compensate for it.
Yeah, and what otherwise would be a moment of frustration now turns into a lovely creme brulee for dessert.
All right, and that's a great place to finish up. Thank you so much for your time, Neil. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here, and happy to help.
If anybody who's on the call has any questions or is interested in trying out the mind print themselves, just shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to connect you guys. So thanks again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.